Welcome back, everyone. So we've been going through Era 3 of the APUSH history time periods, covering 1754 through 1800. And in this video, we're going to look at the events of the American Revolution, and in particular, what factors contributed to the Americans' victory in it, because they really shouldn't have been able to win, at least on paper, since Britain was the most powerful nation in the world militarily. And the Americans were not. Also, there was the risk to the American economy, and this was extremely high because Britain was America's biggest trading partner, so they shouldn't have wanted to disrupt that because it would disrupt trade and cost them tremendous amounts of money. Although the colonies still considered themselves British citizens and part of the empire, they began to organize more formalized protests to Parliament's actions. The First Continental Congress met in the fall of 1774 to coordinate the colonial response to the Intolerable Acts, and they took several actions. They enacted the Suffolk Resolves, which urged colonists to begin making military preparations and to once again begin boycotts. They issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which was a petition to the king begging him to intervene with Parliament and restore their rights, though they did acknowledge Parliament's right to regulate trade. They also established the Continental Association, which created committees in every town whose job it was to enforce the economic sanctions proposed by the Suffolk Resolves. And they promised to meet again the following spring if colonial rights were not restored. England's response, though, was to declare the colony of Massachusetts in a state of rebellion and to send more troops. By the time of the Second Continental Congress began meeting in May of 1775, the war had already broken out, and they had appointed George Washington as commander of the Continental Army in the aftermath of the Battle of Bunker Hill, which we'll look at in just a minute. They also issued a declaration of causes outlining the rationale and necessity for taking up arms, which would hopefully allow them to obtain assistance from other countries in Europe, since any country that they would have approached were all monarchies, and they didn't want potential allies to think this was about throwing off the rule of a monarchy. They were simply dealing with a tyrant. They even authorized the creation of a navy and hired privateers to supplement their naval fleet. Privateers were men who were hired to capture British shipping, which was then sold, and those who did the actual capturing were allowed to keep a significant portion of the profits, which of course just encouraged them to capture even more. The Continental Congress had no explicit legal authority to govern, but it essentially assumed all the functions of a national government, appointing ambassadors, signing treaties, raising armies, appointing generals, obtaining loans from Europe, and even issuing paper money called continentals, and of course dispersing funds. But they had no authority to levy taxes, and simply had to just request money, supplies, and troops from the states to support the war effort. And individual states, though, frequently ignored these requests. And interestingly, at the same time, even in the Second Continental Congress, they were still professing loyalty to the crown. Now, Massachusetts was preparing for war in 1774 even, and the rest of the colonies essentially had to decide if they would start to prepare as well. But not all within the colonies were in agreement, and there was tremendous debate about what to do. In March of 1775, Patrick Henry stood up in the Virginia House of Burgesses, saying to the leaders there, "Mr. President, it is natural to man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to the song of that siren till she transforms us into beast. I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging of the future but by the past. There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Patrick Henry's impassioned speech would be a deciding factor in Virginia beginning to prepare for what he was calling an inevitable war, and yet not a single shot had been fired, although that was coming very soon. The outbreak of the war itself would happen outside of Boston, when British General Thomas Gage became aware of a stockpile of colonial gunpowder and ammunition in the nearby town of Concord. He also had intelligence that placed two of the men he felt were most responsible for the recent troubles, including the Boston Tea Party, John Hancock and Samuel Adams, in the town of Lexington, which was on the road to Concord. He felt he could accomplish two goals with one mission, and set about 1,000 troops late on the evening of April 17, 1775, planning to take both towns by surprise the following morning. Gage had two main routes he could take, but settled on using barges to cross the Charles River. But the movement of troops couldn't be kept secret, and the Sons of Liberty were watching. Several managed to sneak out of the city despite a curfew and warn the countryside that the redcoats were coming, which Henry Wadsworth Longfellow would immortalize in his famous poem, Paul Revere's Ride. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church tower as a signal light, one if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. You know the rest in the books you have read, how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again, under the trees at the turn of the road, only pausing to fire and load. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. A small group of Minutemen had gathered in Lexington, where the soldiers would arrive first, and where those first shots of the war were actually fired. Mostly they just delayed the advancing redcoats, and even then not that much. But it did give time for more Minutemen to head to Concord, and for Hancock and Adams to escape from Lexington. As the British regulars approached Concord, the colonial militia had gathered on the far side of the Old North Bridge, as it would be a bottleneck for the British troops, and the colonists could take cover in both fields and in the tree lines, even hiding themselves before low rock walls that often separated fields and lined roads. This would allow them the maximum protection when confronting the British soldiers, as well as allowing them the element of surprise when they came upon the small contingent of soldiers that had been left to guard the bridge, as others searched the town for the stockpile of weapons and ammunition. Of course, they didn't find much of those weapons, ammunition, and gunpowder because much of it had already been moved. The stand took place at that bridge, as Ralph Waldo Emerson commemorated it 50 years later. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. The British army was forced to retreat, pursued by the colonial militia, all the way back to Boston, with more confrontations along the way, and more militiamen arriving in the area as word spread of what was happening. Before long, British troops were abandoning weapons, clothing, and equipment in order to retreat back to Boston faster. In Boston, the British soldiers ran the risk of being trapped by a siege, and the Americans occupied Boston Neck to do exactly that. Critical to their continued ability to pin the army in Boston was the occupation of the high ground around the city, particularly the hills on the Charlestown Peninsula to the north. Before the British could get their own men into position there, the colonial militias were able to occupy it and dig in, securing cannon on top of Breed's Hill. The initial hope was that the colonies would occupy Bunker Hill, which was higher, though it was a little bit farther from Boston, a situation which General Gage in Boston had to address. So on June 17, 1775, The Redcoats launched an attack on this colonial position, which was being manned by an increasing number of militia from all over New England. Because of their more forward position on Breed's Hill, the Americans risked being surrounded and having their supplies limited, which is exactly what happened, forcing the colonists to hold their fire until their shot was sure. Guns at this time were notoriously inaccurate at distance, and the militias were also directed to aim for officers in order to create the maximum confusion. The militias were able to inflict heavy casualties on the British regulars before they were forced to abandon their position because they were running short on gunpowder. Although the British Army did ultimately take the high ground, officially winning the Battle of Bunker Hill, it was a costly victory, with about half of their fighting strength lost. Despite the fact that the British military had no clear plan for how to win the war with America, for roughly the first 6 months, the Continental Army didn't win a single conflict. Partly it was because the soldiers were poorly armed, poorly trained, and in some cases forced into service by local authorities. The blockade of the major ports hampered the ability of the Continental Army and the militias to get needed supplies, and they were facing more than 10,000 well-trained, well-supplied troops that had landed in New York under General William Howe, plus the thousands of loyalists who had joined the British cause. A smallpox outbreak further decimated the troops, many of whom were due to be released from service very shortly. Seizing their opportunity, British forces attacked, driving the Americans back into New York and New England. Not long after, British regulars arrived on Long Island, easily capturing it because it was completely undefended. They arrived with 427 warships of varying sizes, 32,000 troops, 1,200 cannons, and 10,000 sailors, the largest seaborne military expedition in history to that point, and would face off against a total of about 19,000 militia and new recruits. These were humiliating defeats for the Americans, especially Long Island, but it could have been so much worse if the British Army had moved quicker. Washington's army was able to escape to Manhattan. If not for the courageous actions of the Maryland 400, who launched an attack on the British in order to allow the rest of the colonial army to escape, the entire rebellion could have been crushed before it had barely begun. For their efforts, though, those Maryland 400, although really it's Maryland and Delaware 400, 256 of those men were killed, and over 100 were captured, with only a few dozen surviving. Thomas Paine, hoping to inspire more to join the military effort, had written, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." The tide began to turn when Washington led his troops across the Delaware River on Christmas Eve, 1776, and attacked a group of Hessian soldiers defending the outpost of Trenton in New Jersey. These were German soldiers whom the British were paying to fight on their behalf, and the Americans won this battle, seizing valuable supplies in the process. But the most important victory for the Patriots came in September and October of 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga. British General John Burgoyne was to carry out a plan to isolate New England. He was going to march along Lake Champlain and in the Hudson River Valley with the plan to converge upon Albany, New York, and meet up with General Howe, who was supposed to come up out of New York City. But facing a serious supply problem caused largely by Howe's decision to attack Philadelphia first and then stay there, Burgoyne was forced to send out search parties to look for supplies for his men, and those search parties were attacked by U.S. forces, weakening him further. With just over 7,000 men left, he advanced towards Saratoga, which was on the way to Albany, rather than retreat into winter quarters, which is what Howe was doing in Philadelphia. In the first skirmish with the Americans, the British under Burgoyne gained the ground they sought, but lost another 10% of their forces. All the while, more and more American troops were arriving into the area. By mid-October, the British army was surrounded, and Burgoyne was forced to surrender. By early December, word had reached Benjamin Franklin at Versailles, where he'd been trying to convince the French to join the Patriot cause, that both Philadelphia had fallen, which was a loss, and more importantly, that Burgoyne had surrendered, which was a significant win. France had been hesitant to ally with the Americans because up to this point it really looked like the British were going to win. But within days, King Louis XVI allowed negotiations for an alliance to begin, since this would be an opportunity for him to weaken his age-old enemy. By February of 1788, the Treaty of Alliance was complete, and France declared war on Britain. Within a year, Spain had allied with France, as had the Dutch Republic. With the threat of a wider war, George III had to give up his goal of subduing all of America. The final battle of the war would take place in Virginia, in Yorktown. The French Navy had finally arrived and attacked the British Navy, defeating them in a battle on the Chesapeake Bay, leaving General Lord Charles Cornwallis trapped along the York River between the French Navy at sea and George Washington's troops on land. Thus, he was forced to surrender in October of 1781, effectively ending the war. Upon hearing of the surrender at Yorktown, Lord Frederick North's government, already damaged by the decision to allow Irish Catholics to enlist in the army, suffered even more. By early 1782, a vote of no confidence was taken against the Prime Minister, forcing him to resign. The Whigs, who had grown as the opposition party, were now in control of the government, and they began negotiations for a cessation of hostilities. With the opening of discussions, British troops in America were restricted from launching further offensives. The treaty, signed on September 3, 1783, would recognize American independence and would grant them all the land east of the Mississippi River, north of Florida, and south of Quebec, which the United States had originally wanted as spoils of war, but that the British would keep. Americans would also be granted access to the rich Newfoundland fishery. France would gain an island in the Caribbean, as well as Senegal in Africa, while the Spanish would regain Florida. The last British troops would leave New York in November 1783. And so that is how the Americans won the Revolutionary War. And that covers what you need to know about Unit 3, Topic 5.